Welcome everyone to another episode of 75 Days of Partition. Today is day 19, and it's my absolute honor to welcome Professor Ian Talbot to the event. My name is Ganita with the 1947 Partition Archive, and we started this event series on the 3rd of June. We're continuing it through the 17th of August, marking 75 days between the Mountbatten Plan and the announcement, the public announcement of the Radcliffe Line. So Professor Talbot, you have done some incredible work on Lahore and Amritsar, and you've compiled some of it in the past in your book, Divided Cities. I don't know if you have a copy of that book. And so we're going to hear a little bit today about, a specific massacre that happened on June 20th, 21st, 75 years ago today, in Lahore, but we're going to put it in the context of kind of your work, your greater work on these twin cities. I'll leave the floor open. I'd love to hear more about, if you want to kind of start out with what happened on June 21st in Shah Alami Bazar in Lahore.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm delighted to be able to do that and to share in this exciting approach leading up to partition. So on the 20th and the 21st of June, 1947, in Lahore, there was a massive fire in the Shah Alami area of the city. This was a large Hindu residential and commercial area, by the Shah Alami Gate. The gate was one of the famous gates of the city of Lahore, and it was named after a Mughal emperor who had actually died in Lahore in, I think, 1712. So the whole area was a commercial area, and it was an area where within the walled city, there was a significant Hindu community. Though obviously there were also significant Hindu communities outside of the walled city. The wealthy lived in Model Town. There was also the suburbs of Lahore, places like Krishan Nagar, Sant Nagar, still known by that name today in Lahore. And also, of course, the Sikh community was quite concentrated around an area called Chunamandi. So all told, the Hindu and Sikh community of Lahore was about a third of the total population at the time of partition. When this violence occurred, this was in the weeks leading up to the holding a month later of the Boundary Commission sittings in the city of Lahore. And Lahore was contested by all the parties. So we're talking about the violence in the context of political tension as to what would be the future of the city of Lahore. Whilst it was true that the Muslims were in the majority in the city, the Congress and also the Sikh community were claiming that the historical and also economic development of the city of Lahore owed much to the non-Muslim community. And it was on that basis that they were claiming that Lahore should go to India. So everything is very uncertain. There's been tension in the city, not just because of this impending boundary commission sitting, but also tension going back to March when the unionist government of Kizar Tawana, a cross-community party, resigned. And that sparked off the first round of violence at the beginning of March. This violence in June was in some senses different to the earlier violence in that it was more about destruction of property than actual killings of individuals. And it was marked by large-scale arson attacks throughout this area of the city. Later on, the British administration were criticized. Why couldn't they do anything about it? And the arguments which they made was that this was, some of the narrow streets were so congested, it was difficult to actually apprehend arsonists. there were limited police. There were only 3,000 police in the whole of the greater city area of Lahore at this time. The fire brigade itself was undermanned, didn't necessarily have a regular access to water supplies. So if people were set upon burning down properties, they had a good chance to succeed in a congested inner city area like this. And the destruction after the burning of this area on the night, particularly of the 21st of June, was so great that people described it as being a bit like a bombed out city after an air attack.
Wow.
And people were talking about it in terms of the British officials of the London Blitz. It reminded them of that. So you can see we're not talking about just a few isolated fires being spread here and there. We're talking about massive destruction of property. And all told, certainly this wasn't the only episode of arson, but all told, it's reckoned that by the time of the actual date of independence, about 6,000 houses and businesses had been destroyed in Lahore as a result of arson attacks. But this episode at Shah Alami was the most dramatic because of the extent of the burnings, and also because of its significance. As I said, it comes a month or so before the Boundary Commission meets, but in a way you could say it's sort of marking out territory before then and saying, Lahore is a Muslim city, and whatever the Boundary Commission comes up with, it's a Muslim city. And in that sense, there's a political element to it. I mean, sometimes with the partition violence, people talk about it as religiously motivated or revenge attacks. But here, there's very much this dimension of territory and inscribing authority. So rich Hindus, and they weren't just those who were living in places like model towns. Some Hindus chose to live within the walled city for the cultural life of the city itself. But they realized that regardless of what might happen with the boundary award, that would they be safe? So many of them began, after the Shah Alami episode, to move out of Lahore and to change its demographics still further in favor of a Muslim majority area. Many of them who did move out didn't necessarily think they would have to move forever, but they nonetheless saw this as a temporary measure because of the insecure conditions. So in that sense, it marks an important, I think, development, in this clash for territory and real estate, literally, in a city which is contested and which both the non-Muslim community for economic reasons, but also the Muslim community for demographic reasons can lay a claim to. So I think that's why it is so significant in the history leading up to partition, as well as, of course, the level of shock that this brought to the communities. Could it be justified at all? The Muslim narrative at the time was that the Shah Alami area, and there was some truth in this, was an area where lots of weapons had been stored, and in which organizations like RSS were active. So the mayor, a Muslim mayor of Lahore, talks about it. You can almost hear the language of today coming out as a kind of terrorist nest, and that was the sort of justification that was given. There was an immediate justification as well, if you want to look at it in terms of this is a cycle of revenge killings, and that a day or two earlier there'd been a bomb attack in a vegetable market, which was obviously targeting the predominantly Muslim community who were there at that time. So there are these sort of background issues, but I think that it's a combination of these local issues and the wider political context, in terms of what's going to happen to Lahore, where's it going to land up, when the boundary is drawn, which need to be understood. And that prompts perhaps preemptive action like this taking place. Though having said that, I don't want to give the impression, and this is why I produced the book on Lahore and Amritsar, that all of this is one-sided and that there's only one particular community you can blame for the violence. Depends where you're looking. You see similar things happening in Amritsar, in Muslim localities being attacked there at this same period of time. And indeed, what is interesting is I interviewed a person's sort of family of someone who was an arsonist at the time of the Shah Alami sort of fire, and it was clear that they'd left Amritsar only very shortly beforehand, following a violent attack there. So you can see how some of these people who were engaged in these acts of arson were actually revenging attacks against their community, in a different context. So that's very important to bear in mind, that you can't look at any one episode in isolation from what is happening across the board, because if you do, it can give a very distorted view of who's responsible for violence. All of this is sort of interconnected, and it's all to do with what the final Punjab British governor, Sir Evan Jenkins, called a communal war of succession. He said that this wasn't traditional sort of religious conflict or clashes, around processions or music before mosques or things like that. This has to be understood in terms of communities competing for power and trying to establish their power. So the tendency would be that areas where one community is in the majority, they're more likely to be the aggressors, and the minority are more likely to be the victims. But then you can flip it, because obviously, given the demographics of Punjab particularly, there's areas where all communities are in a minority status. It's not just overwhelmingly one particular community. And then, of course, as I say, there's the sort of escalating effects of the need for revenge coming in when violence happens. So the violence at Shah Alami is significant. It marks an important turning point, if you like, in the struggle for power in a post-British Lahore, when it's still not clear where that city is actually going to be, because of the boundary award not even having started to sit until a month after.
And it's significant because there's an exodus.
Yes, it's very significant because there's an exodus. I think I said right at the beginning that the Hindu and Sikh population, roughly, I mean, we're using very rough figures here because the 1941 census was probably the most unreliable of all the censuses. But we're talking about 240,000 people in the city. By the time of the last few days before independence, that's gone down to about 10,000. that gives you an indication of the exodus that's happening. People are, and you can read it in the newspapers as well. It's fascinating. If you look at the newspapers of this period, people are offering houses for sale or exchanging houses. People living in what could become Pakistan are exchanging houses with those who are living in India and might go to Pakistan. Right. You know, people are moving their bank accounts. And that's an important thing because Lahore was a great banking center. Probably about a third of all the banks in the country were based in Lahore. So people are beginning to move their bank accounts to Delhi, Bombay, elsewhere.
State Bank of India was based in Lahore.
Yeah. You know, and also, of course, what it's doing, this exodus, is it's sort of, even before the final bloodletting, it's transforming the demography of the area and inevitably reducing the minority population presence. Now, from a purely economic perspective, that doesn't make any sense for the would-be state of Pakistan and Lahore within it, because most of the businesses in Lahore are run by Hindus or Sikhs. Most of the people in banking sector are. Industries are Anarkali Bazar, the famous Anarkali Bazar. Most of the shops were owned by Hindus. So by having this preemptive movement of population, you're undermining the economy, you know, of the future Pakistan state before it even gets going, you know, because this is a huge chunk, you know, of movement of population. But the same thing's happening to an extent in Amritsar. The Muslim skilled workers in carpet industry, textile industry, are already, some of them, moving to Lahore because of violence in that city before the boundary is drawn, before independence. You know, and the city of Amritsar is set back economically by the loss of skilled labor as a result of this migration. So you can see how what's happening already is that the future demography and the future economic problems of the border areas, particularly, you know, are being drawn way before the actual boundary, you know, is drawn itself, because people are voting with their feet, you know, and are deciding that it might be a good thing. And of course, it's the more able, you know, you might want to use the term entrepreneurial, I don't know, but the preemptive migration tends to come from those classes of people. It's the really poor often who are left stranded, you know, in these cities once independence comes. And these are the ones, you know, who are going to be really very vulnerable to violence thereafter. So there is this preemptive move. But one final point, I think, which is important, is that we mustn't read back with hindsight, you know, the view that this divide, you know, is going to be such that there's going to be no coming back. Right. Many people who did shift thought that they were doing this on a temporary basis.
I would say from our interviews, it seems like vast majority of them felt that way.
That's right. They do. They feel that way. So it's easy for us with hindsight, you know, to make it look a lot clearer than the reality, which was a situation of confusion, of chaos, of great tension. Because Lahore and Amritsar, for that matter, you know, by the time of this violence in June, these were almost divided into enclaves anyway, you know, with no-go areas. There were steel gates at the entrances to localities. There were watchmen. You know, the city was under such tension, you know, that often there were nightly curfews going on. People, even during the daytime, business was beginning to cease because people didn't want to travel across community lines, you know, and barriers even during the day. You certainly wouldn't venture out after dark, even if there wasn't a curfew to do that. So the cities were being divided up, so that there is this sort of boundary demarcation happening again,
right.
before there's any formal boundary being drawn. So that's the context in which you have episodes, like this particular one occurring. And there's great suspicion, mistrust, even before independence, of the other communities, So this is why, I mean, it may look quite cynical what the mayor of Lahore was saying about, all these weapons and everything being stored there as a kind of justification for the violence. But he may well have believed it, because there was this level, of not trusting other communities, and thinking that they're preparing for violence. And in some cases that the communities were, preparing for violence. So that again, needs to be, I think, factored in, when we're talking about justifications. And it's easy to dismiss them, but it's not easy to put yourself in the situation where you have absolutely no trust, in another community and its attitudes towards you, and this wasn't just on one side. This was on all sides. All communities had these.
And it was a pretty complicated. There's many layers of what was going on, because I know when we interviewed Kushwan Singh, for example, he was an author.
Yes.
Came from a pretty prominent family. He was being asked to stay behind in Lahore by Jinnah himself, because he was a lawyer, a very prominent lawyer, and he was being asked to stay on with his talent. My own family, my grandfather, in fact, they owned multiple homes. One was in Model Town, one was on Lake Road in front of Anarkali Bazar. It was a very sort of historic home. And they had decided to stay on and become Pakistani. But on August 14th, they were asked to leave without their belongings. My grandfather was asked to leave without his belongings, because he had, I guess, within the sort of more, I guess, the educated communities, he had been encouraged to stay on. But then when the reality struck on August 14th, another community asked him to leave. And he was not allowed to take any of his things with him, any of his belongings. So it's really interesting that there's this dynamic of multiple layers of different forces kind of fighting for different things.
That's right. I mean, obviously, there was an incentive for, as I say, the Muslim League national leadership to want minorities to stay in Pakistan, because they were so valuable economically or professionally. Because I mean, if you think about it, the Muslim community was much sort of poorer in many respects, educationally. Also, it didn't have such a representation in commerce, business. So if all those people left, there'll be a huge gap there that the state would have to somehow or other try and address, and I think that's the reason why communities were being sort of encouraged not to move, partly, but just out of economic factors.
And I wanted to kind of just press on your point earlier that it's not one-sided, because in cities like Ambala, you had your more, your upper class was Muslim. And in Jalandhar, it was the educated upper class was Muslim. And there was a mass sort of exodus from those cities into Pakistan. So it did kind of happen on both sides in a similar manner.
That's right, it was, and I think, I mean, one of the things to bear in mind is that people don't like leaving their homes. They only leave their homes under duress, really, when it comes down to it, because people were rooted in their communities. It wasn't an easy thing to do, to move. And I think that's explains, the level of fear, of violence, that was behind these mass migrations that no one really expected on the scale that happened in August 1947 and beyond.
And I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned that the fire brigades in Lahore had, I think there was some messaging around them being understaffed. What was the situation with law and order? Like, what was going on? Why were they understaffed? And why was there nothing being done?
I think that one of the problems was the rundown of the communities, the civil service during the war years. And you've got to remember, this is only a couple of years after the end of the Second World War. Britain itself is facing austerity at home. There is not necessarily the resources there that there might have been at an earlier stage, to properly pay for fire engines, for fire appliances, for crew. I think, again, we've got to see layers here. I mean, an easy answer would be, and this was one that certainly some politicians, both Muslim League and Congress for that matter, raised, was that the British gave up. They weren't interested anymore. Why would they bother with this? They were leaving. And I think that ultimately it's always about the resources and follow the money. And there wasn't the resources there. I don't think the British were totally callous, and that's why they didn't sort of douse these flames. I think they tried to sort of douse the flames, but they didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to do it. And probably to have the wherewithal to do it would have needed a reinforcement, economic, military, political reinforcement of the British presence in India. And that just wasn't acceptable either to, quite rightly, to nationalists who've been struggling for a long time for freedom. Why would they suddenly want this happening? But also it wouldn't have been acceptable to a British electorate, which is facing problems, on the home front. Why would we be spending all this money, when we're going to be leaving in a few years anyway? So there's that context to it. So I think that it was easy to score political points, and to say that there just wasn't an interest. But I think the British were always, I'm not trying to whitewash either the Punjab government or the government of India here, but I think that they had a sense of their own prestige, if you read the memoirs, and they didn't necessarily want to appear to have ended on a totally sort of chaotic note. That was the reality, but I don't think they would have willed that, as an outcome that suited them. I think that I think helps to explain it. But the Punjab governor, the records are there in the India office in London. Records. He actually drew up quite a long memo right on the last day, virtually, of British rule, and tried to address some of these questions that we're addressing now. Why did these things happen on the scale which they did? Obviously, he's going to argue the case, that it's not his responsibility, and they did all they could. But I think, even if you accept that element is there and there's a self-serving note to it, you've also got to look at it in terms of the wider resource implications surrounding, the end of the Raj, which is really facing major problems. You could argue that that was the reason why the British were prepared to give independence in the first place, that they weren't making any money out of India anymore. India was costing the British ultimately after the Second World War, and that's a factor, I think, in as well as obviously the mass struggle, for freedom that's going on. So that probably helps partly to explain why these fire. I mean, they had fire watchers, they had fire appliances, they did all kinds of things to try and stop the arson attacks. But I mean, these are on such a big scale.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the odd individual, sort of doing this. It was quite concerted and organized. I came across an interview with someone when I was doing the book, was talking about sort of large amounts of kerosene being brought up. It was a pre-planned, kind of organized activity. It wasn't just the odd troublemaker.
No, it was very organized. We hear from people who were actually part of the violence, not this particular episode we've talked about today.
Yeah.
And a lot of these young boys were basically drawn to this finders keepers mentality that if they were to drive out minorities, they got to keep the property that they had taken over.
Yeah.
And for a lot of young men, that was what drew them into these acts of violence that were being led, like you said, a lot of times by local, people vying for political power in the upcoming independence. There was a lot of possibility, I guess, for people. They saw a lot of possibility in gaining power.
That's right. I mean, there was a good point. There's a combination of interests coming up here. That there's the political interest, the wider struggle. And then there's the personal local interest. What might you gain by looting somewhere?
Right.
That there's that element as well. And it probably, if we're trying to explain the intensity of the violence, not just in this episode, but more generally in the Punjab, I think it's because there's this combination of these two factors in the violence. There's the politics of it, and the acceptability that in this political situation, this is the kind of action you can take, and a sense of impunity that the British are just about to depart. They're not going to be able to sort of do anything about this. So there's that angle, and then there's the angle of here's a chance, to improve my lot, and if I take part in this, I may gain lots of valuables as a result, and these are coming together. These elements are quite powerful drivers of
Absolutely.
violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. And I think another element to explore, not on this conversation, but probably future, maybe with you sometime, is, how you talked about, well, India was no longer profitable. And also, I wonder how that profit-making when the East India Company was nationalized, because now India was not being driven, this colonization was no longer driven by profits, but suddenly there was actually, a democratic institution, and you can see that the expansion stops at that point of the
That's
empire.
right. Yeah, I mean, that's true. And
people are starting to talk about, well, wait a second, now that the electorate is involved, they're like, well, what are we doing out there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And one can never, I think, underestimate the significance of the Second World War.
Yeah.
In terms of all of this, because in a sense, the Second World War, one, it impoverishes Britain. I mean, Britain is in hock to the United States as a result of this, but also India's value no longer is so significant for Britain, partly because of the fact that, and this is the result of Indian nationalists' successes along the way, that the British are paying now for the operations of the British Indian Army in a way that they weren't in the past. They couldn't rely on this. So now they're actually owing money, to the government of India because of all this wartime expenditure which had to be undertaken, and the expansion of the army during the war. At one level, the Indian Army was important for the success of the war, but it also undermined the economic infrastructure of rule as well. And I think that's an important factor. So it all becomes too much, at the end. And once that is the factor, that you can't readily reverse
right
the situation.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've gone over time a little bit, but this has been so illuminating and fascinating. I think it's something that I had never heard before, but it makes total sense that this particular date was such a turning point in terms of Amritsar and Lahore, especially Lahore. And that changed the dynamic of migrations and the eventual boundary drawings. So thank you so much for joining us. And I hope people will get a chance to look at your book, Divided Cities. Sorry, is that, I don't know if you have a copy, maybe you can.
Yes.
If you can show everybody. Yes, thank you so much. And we look forward to hosting you again to dive deeper into some of these issues.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to